On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Daniel Kador. He is the VP of Engineering at Clockwise. We're going to be actually taking a slightly different angle on this episode. Clockwise, and I'll have Dan talk about it a little bit more himself, but they produced this amazing document with a ton of metrics around engineering metrics. And going to have Dan kind of walk us through some of the highlights and also, talk about how they're applying some of this, some of these metrics internally. We will make the document available to you. We'll link it in the show notes so that everyone can kind of go follow along. It's a super awesome resource. Dan, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start off asking two things always. One is tell us what Clockwise does, and then what are some of your responsibilities as the VP of Engineering?
So Clockwise is a team time management platform, and we help customers like Uber, Reddit, New York Times, Brex, and many more make time for what matters, especially in their engineering teams. So we're not a calendar app. Instead, we work on behalf of our users to actually create more free time in their calendars.
Awesome. I know. We're going to get into some of the metrics that you guys are obviously have visibility into. And then as a VP of Engineering, what are some of your responsibilities?
Yeah, it's a classic VP of Engineering role. I am the senior most engineering leader in the company. I report to our CEO and help manage the team responsible for building our product at Clockwise, help make technical decisions about kind of future and direction of where we're headed as a company, and and help make sure the lights stay on and we're doing our job for our customers.
Awesome. All right. Let's dive in. Want to hopefully cover as much as we can. As I mentioned, we'll make the document accessible so somebody can either follow along or they can take a look at it hopefully afterwards. I guess, tell us about the document. Tell us what am I looking at? Where does this data come from? Let's start at the high level.
Yeah, so we're looking at what we call the 2022 Software Engineering Meeting Benchmark Report. And basically, it's a big report consisting of data about how engineering teams meet and their meeting culture, and like what actually shows up on their calendars from most of 2022. So it's a big data set consisting of 1.5 million meetings across 80,000 plus engineers and 5,000 plus companies. We have this data because our customers sign up for Clockwise, again, so we can help them create more time for what matters in their workday. As part of that, we get access to or granted access to their Google Calendar through a standard OAuth process. And as a result, we get to start introspecting their calendars so we can act on their behalf to move meetings around, deconflict things, basically kind of act as the assistant that most of us wish we had, but don't. And then once we do that in aggregate, we start having some pretty interesting data where we can see trends across many companies.
Absolutely. And I guess the one, I read through the document. The one thing I kept coming away with was the topic around focus time. And I guess let's just, if somebody does go into the document, what does focus time mean in this context?
Yeah. I think many of us in engineering are familiar with this dichotomy of meters versus makers. When we think about focus time, what we're really talking about is an uninterrupted block of time that's at least 2 hours long. The time where, as a maker, you need that amount of time to really get into a flow state and be able to think strategically and critically about a problem and then solve it and not get distracted.
Absolutely. What I came away with looking at this was, and you're the engineering leader, but I'm like, oh my God, engineers nearly do not have nearly a 40-hour work week working on solving problems. They, depending on the current activities, all that gets fragmented. And I guess, the one stat that I kind of saw that I was like, this is interesting because we hear about this constantly about medium and large companies being a little bit slower and not as nimble as small companies. And I think the one stat that was interesting is that, I'm reading this, is 36% more time is spent on one-on-ones when you're at a medium or larger company as an engineer. I thought that was staggering.
Yeah. I think, there's what's cool about this report is that it, I think, quantifies a lot of what we've felt kind of intuitively as we've spent time at various companies in our careers and talked to our peers and colleagues at those companies. Yeah, I mean, there really is what we refer to internally as like a meeting coordination tax that increases as the size of the company you're at increases. And, and that's based on aggregate reporting. I think there are really interesting outliers at every size of company that have figured out some best practices or figured out some methodology for having a healthy meeting culture and reducing the amount of time spent in meetings. But yeah, on average, you can really see it in the data, which is cool.
So I guess the one thing that I was looking at this and going, the concept of focus time, deep work, focusing deeply, that's super important for an engineer. As an engineering leader, how do you help your team? I mean, you see these metrics. How do you help your team to actually have, gain some of that force multiplier of being able to deeply focus and be able to get more out of their day?
Yeah, you can imagine at a company like ours, we think a lot about the amount of time our engineers get to focus on the problems in front of them. We actually track this, not even just for our engineering team. We track this as a company level metric. So one of our top level KRs across quarter to quarter, across the year, is really about the amount of focus time people at the company get. And it's not just focused on ICs, but for my engineering team, it's one of the main things that we're thinking about. And so what's cool to see is we do have some benchmarking against other companies, and so we can see we are in the very top percentiles of amount of focus time per engineer, which is great. And I think the way we get there is I don't want to shill the product too much, but I actually do believe it works. So we use the product, we use it the way it's intended, and so we are actually like. Our whole team, basically, almost all of our meetings are marked as what we call flexible. And so our system is automatically moving them around, or what we call like defragging the calendar very regularly. That happens every day. And it generates a lot of focus time for us. Outside of using the product, because there are important rituals that we kind of take advantage of, we're doing things like experimenting pretty regularly with like no meeting days, or really leaning more and more, especially recently, into asynchronous communication tools. So, going beyond the Slacks of the world and into things like Loom, really leaning into better documentation with Notion, even using, going back to Slack, like Slack video, Slack audio messages. These are the kinds of things where we can point people to those tools and say, do you actually need a meeting for this? If you do, great, let's have a meeting. If not, though, let's try to keep the meeting load low.
Absolutely. Yeah, you mentioned fragmented time, defragging, and the one stat that was interesting, and I started actually paying attention when I read this last, I think it was a week and a half ago, and I started paying attention to my own week. And this is for engineers, obviously, so it's out of context for me, but I just thought it was interesting to actually reflect was 6.3 hours are spent in between meetings, which is the fragmented time. That on a, let's say we want our people to work 40 hours in a theoretical world. That's 1/7. I mean, a little bit, not quite, but that's a massive amount of time, 6 hours, almost, an hour and a quarter a day where you're just not useful because you're just, meetings were not properly scheduled and they're not optimal. I mean, do you guys have any, like, are you applying that internally to avoid some of that? I know you mentioned the calendaring of flexible time, but like when you guys are looking at that, have you tried, hey, we only do meetings during these blocks and outside of that, the rest of the time, save it for tomorrow? I mean, have you tried anything?
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of, in many ways, really the underlying premise of the product is turning that fragmented time into more usable time. And so, yeah, it's definitely one of the big focuses of how we run the team. And, I think we've all had that day of, I'm in 4 hours of Zoom meetings, but I've got 30 minutes between each of them. So all I'm doing is those 4 hours of Zooms. Yeah. So it's definitely something we pay a lot of attention to. And the product helps, and we also, have a little bit of training as every new employee onboards on, like, hey, as you're scheduling meetings, try to be aware of what you might be doing in terms of Swiss cheesing the day. The product, our product also tries to generate suggestions when you schedule to be like, this time is actually better. It's going to generate more focus time. If you book it here, this is going to be the negative impact. You still can, of course, like sometimes you just need to meet during that slot, and that's okay. But, we try to point out the things that might be harder to understand, just as, a human trying to get a meeting on the calendar.
Absolutely. I guess one-on-ones, going back to that, I mean, that's a big time drain, not only for the actual engineers, but I mean, the management layer. I mean, an engineer he probably has one-on-one for the week or bi-weekly or whatever the frequency is, but a manager is spending, one-on-ones throughout their team, and then they have to go have a one-on-one with their manager, obviously. So all of a sudden, you're multiplying the time spent. And I guess we need it. We need to hear, especially in remote, companies where you don't get that face time. Have you guys seen anything that helps improve just how you structure your one-on-ones, or do you have any thoughts on how what you guys have seen with the one-on-ones?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the key that we've found to having effective one-on-ones, whether they're one-on-ones between managers and the people who report to them, or skip levels, or just, cross-org one-on-ones, is really about, it's not rocket science. It's really about having a good agenda where ahead of time there's a document. The document contains, things like, all my one-on-ones, I have a document that says, here's each iteration of the meeting. We're going to do feedback up front, bi-directional. It's really important to me. It's frankly more important to me to hear feedback from them to me about the things that I could be doing better, serving them more effectively, and topics that we can capture as we think about things throughout the week of, like, this one's not urgent, but I'd love to ask, one of my people, like, what's the status of this thing that I'm not in the stand-up for, or them saying, like, I've got this question about the business, can you help contextualize a decision for me? I didn't quite understand, whatever it is. And then just really sticking to that routine. And then, being free to give time back when it's not necessary. So I think those are some of the basics, but they work really, I think, effectively. And then in terms of one of the things that we see, you referred to kind of this meeting coordination tax as the size of organizations grows. I think, having lived that a little bit and experienced it personally, one of the reasons behind I need to have my one-on-one with my TPM and my product manager and the group product manager and, like, the marketing lead and the sales lead for my group is because, some of that's important, and you should be meeting monthly, maybe quarterly. I think in big organizations, those revert to, like, let's meet once a week, because they haven't figured out effective means of group communication, whether that's better team meetings or whether that's, again, leaning more into asynchronous communication tools that allow people to share state more freely. So they just fall back to, let's just meet. And I think that's an anti-pattern. Like, that's something to be interrogated.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think as the last couple of years, remote has become the norm. I don't know what will happen in the future, but we've dealt with it. It almost feels that sometimes we've just taken what we did and we just applied it. And obviously, we had years and decades to, get to a very, I was going to say efficient, but a process that works in person. And we've had 24 to 36 months of dealing with all of a sudden adjusting. And the one thing that you're mentioning I find interesting is you talk about asynchronous communication. Obviously, when you're in the office, it's easy. Let's just round up. Let's do the stand up. It's done. But when we're not there, when you have a Zoom, you lose. I guess it's not asynchronous to a certain degree, but you lose so much of the in person. Like, is it possible to go, hey, let's something like leave voice notes for each other or record little audio snippets of our ritual, and everyone can just listen to them. First thing in the morning, we don't have to do a meeting. You just listen to them. And if there is a sidebar, you then go deal with it. But if it's just information so that the whole team just is, gathering that information, I think it'd be really interesting to have. I think the asynchronous stand up would be very intriguing for a lot of companies to try.
Yeah, absolutely, and we certainly do. Our sprint kind of our agile ceremonies include synchronous plannings, retros, and things like that. And we sometimes do synchronous stand-ups if there's something important to talk about as a group, but oftentimes we default to asynchronous stand-ups. And I think, more broadly, one of the mistakes that engineering leaders, or really people leaders, are sometimes making in reflecting back on the last 24 or 36 months is conflating the logistical impossibilities of getting together in person during a pandemic with what it might be like to practice remote first practices, but still get together from time to time for socialization and bonding and culture building purposes. And that's really how we're trying to operate here, and how I've tried to lead this team is we run remote first. We have an office in San Francisco. It's optional to come in. We have we have lunch a couple of days a week. People come in. We have a nice time together. But, meetings are all remote first. We're operating in that way. And then we make time to come together. We just had an on-site 2 weeks ago. We brought the whole company together to San Francisco. We got to hang out, spend that time together. That is really critical. But I don't think it has to inform every meeting must be synchronous as a way to generate sort of bonding. That's just, I think, unnecessary and frankly not, I think is wasteful, and also not what employees want. They don't want to be in a slew of meetings every day.
Yeah, I think that's a super interesting point, because I talked to a lot of engineering leaders on the podcast, and the one question I do like to ask is how, whether it makes it the podcast or just from my understanding of the broader market, is how they deal with the team building. And a lot of times it's one-on-ones. I hear that a lot, that one-on-ones is my team building. And I think what you just said was one-on-ones really are not team building. It's an information dissemination ritual to make sure everyone has, per Agile Scrum, the commitments of their responsibilities and what blocking that might exist. But outside of that, they don't last very long. I see my teammate, but am I really bonding? Have I done anything to kind of feel closer to them? I probably haven't. I just am probably get my piece done, get me off of this. I need to go defragment my calendar because I've got all these meetings and I need to get some jam and some work between it. It is interesting, as you just mentioned, that we rely on this one-on-one as a way to check in on, or not the one-on-one, but the daily stand-up. The one-on-one obviously is meant for checking in, but the daily stand-up, to your point, is I do think it's highly inefficient at times, depending on the size of the group as well.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, I look at the stand-up as a way to quickly disseminate state and then generate potential follow-ups that need to happen outside the context of that stand-up, right? But yes, one-on-ones, I think remote one-on-ones at their best can definitely be used to build relationship, but it's harder. And I think generally, there's multiple kinds of one-on-ones, right? There's the let's quickly check on state. There's the hey, check in how you're doing. There's the career building and professional development kind of one-on-one mentorship. So, you have to alternate between those as is appropriate for, whatever the person you're working with needs. But ultimately at the end of the day, I still think it's important to get time in person. And, one of the things I'll do every now and then is say I'll just go do I live in San Francisco. Some of my team are in South Bay. They don't come to the office that often. So I'll just do a South Bay road trip. I'm just going to go visit y'all. And then of course we bring people to the office, semi-regularly.
Absolutely. I guess the final question I was going to ask you about the metrics, and I'm curious of your opinion, because I saw that an average software engineer spends 19.3 hours in focus time. I haven't decided if I think, wow, that's pretty remarkable, or wow, in a 40-hour work week, that's inefficient. Because I'm also thinking, if I was an engineering leader and I need to deliver other, to the roadmap, small, medium, large company, I need to know my hiring cadence. If I know I only have 20 hours of real productivity out of an employee, not 40, and I'm going into sprint planning thinking, oh, this guy thinks he's going to, hit certain velocity, but in reality, the velocity is never going to surpass. That's the maximum velocity. I mean, I don't know if that's a lot or little. I guess it's for each person to determine. But I'm shocked that it was 19.3 once you take out all the overhead.
Yeah, I think this is a very individualized and sort of organization by organization planning exercise to decide, where do I sit on this spectrum? Because again, this is a pretty wide spectrum. We're talking averages here, about half, a little less than half an engineer's time being spent in what you could think of as like maker time. There are some organizations that are much better. We're lucky enough to count ourselves as one of those. It's something we pay attention to. And there's some organizations that have significantly fewer hours per engineer. And I think those are the ones where you have to say like, all right, well, let's look at our budgets and how we're thinking about hiring and how we're thinking about, where we're placing our strategic bets for investment for the company. And maybe one of them needs to be, we got to figure out how to make the team more productive.
Yeah, it's almost like, I know lawyers, billable hours are super important. Consultants, billable hours are super important. It almost feels as though tracking the internal service that's provided to the team by an engineer, and not a billable hour because it's not billable, but serviceable time. Obviously everyone tracks it, but this is very eye opening because I think finding even an hour to massive percentage points here that you could shift things. So very interesting. Thanks for coming on. Thanks for sharing. Again, we'll try to make this doc available to listeners so they can hopefully, as we're talking about these data metrics, you can scroll through. You'll see exactly what we kind of have gone through. I guess as our time's expiring, I always like to wrap up with two things. One is if you could ask a future guest to answer one question or have them talk about a topic you'd like to listen to, what would that be?
I'm very interested in, as you can probably tell, asynchronous communication tools and the way that people are kind of modernizing and evolving the way their organization works together. So I'm always very interested to hear from other leaders who are kind of pushing the boundaries of, how their companies operate. There are some companies that do the no meeting culture. And I think they're fascinating, and I'd love to hear from them, especially in the moments that get hard in a company where you're like it's easy to default to a meeting. What do you do in that case? That would be fascinating to hear, kind of the brutal honesty there.
Yeah, I think that would be I think that could be a very interesting topic to see how many people actually have actually moved to that asynchronous model on some of their activities. I'm sure they have because a lot of us use Slack, but it is going to be a good one. Also, if somebody wants to reach out to you, we talked a lot of data points. Maybe they want to just pick your brain on something you mentioned. What's a good way of getting a hold of you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. It should be pretty easy. My name's not that common, so it shouldn't be too hard to Google me. And you can just hit me up on email too. I'm just dan@getclockwise.com.
Awesome. We'll make sure we leave some of those links in the show notes. Thanks again for being on, Dan. This was really interesting to cover these data points.
Yeah, glad to go over it with you. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, if you're using the asynchronous communication tools in your engineers' daily lives, let's have you on. I'd love to get more views on how with those best practices look for your team. And if the podcast is useful, share it. Leave a review in Apple or Google or wherever you listen to the podcast. That always helps us, and that's how we've kind of grown. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.